powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu.
Somewhere Europe has to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not Europe's problems.
चुन चुन करके हिसाब लेना ये मेरी फितरत है.
Why should it be a problem? If I'm smart enough to have multiple options, you should be admiring me.
भारत झुकने वाला भी नहीं.
The rise of India will be determined by India. It will be determined by our strength, not by the mistakes of others.
The old order is not coming back. We shouldn't mourn it. Nostalgia is not a strategy.
Yes, welcome back to my channel. See, what if I told you that both Russia and India walked into Western design trap and somehow they came out stronger? Russia was actually supposed to become a compliant European power after the Soviet collapse. And and India was supposed to become another developing economy permanently somehow plugged into the Western financial and security architecture. Or you can say Western trap. And logic, if you look around, if you go deep into it, you find the logic was pretty simple. The same logic was applied on South Korea, the same logic was applied on the Middle East, same logic was applied on Singapore. And in all of these places, the logic worked. Logic was that pull the country into Western institutions, like pull Russia into Western institutions, pull India into Western dependency networks and all that. Integrate both into system that they don't control. They did not control. Same method, same mechanism was applied everywhere in the Middle East, whether it was Singapore, South Korea, Japan, you name it. So for Russia, the problem started after Soviet Union collapsed, and it was Boris Yeltsin. For Russia, the treatment was Boris Yeltsin, the trick was Boris Yeltsin, then economic shock therapy, then invitation to Western clubs like G7. And for India, it was mainly the debt crisis, then security pressure, then proxy wars using Pakistan, sanctions, and repeated basically moments of strategic vulnerabilities. Like Khalistan movement, right? Now, on paper, both countries should have become dependent, just like other countries. But something happened. What happened, we all know for the most part, right? Every pressure point that was designed to create leverage, like for example, defense, energy, trade, finance, and diplomacy and all, it all actually became reason for India and Russia to move closer together. And over time, what happened is that they started solving these problems, each other's biggest weaknesses, and started to complement those. So in this video, we are going to talk about how India and Russia actually helped each other from becoming Western vassals. If you like this type of geopolitical analysis, if you like this type of deep dive into the subject like this, then please do like and subscribe my channel. Let's get going. Let's get started. See, the first mechanism, the way West tried to actually trap India and Russia was through the diplomatic trap. And to understand this thing, you have to first of all look into the Cold War phase, and then you have to look into it post-Cold War phase. All right. Now, see, in those days, actually, oil sanctions, BRICS, all that was not going to work because the Russians had oil. There was no petrodollar as such, so sanctions were not going to work. And BRICS just wasn't around, right? So how they were going to do all this, the diplomacy part of it, the diplomatic trap. So See, and also you have to understand this. Whatever happened with Soviet Union, aka Russia, and whatever happened with India, it was happening in parallel too. Okay, you have to understand this. So after independence of India in 1947, India faced lots of wars. India was under tremendous pressure. When British left India, they left India uh, with everything. They took everything from India, and India was left with nothing. I mean, the situation was so bad that India didn't even manufacture a needle. Forget the rest. So, and then on top of that, India faced wars 1947, 1962, 1965, 1971, 1998, so on and so forth. Okay. And 1962 war conflict was with China. Now, and then while this was happening on India side, South Asia side, the Cold War basically had divided the world into two blocks. Okay, one was Soviet Union led bloc, other one was US and United Kingdom led bloc. Now you have to understand the creation of Pakistan was not because Pakistanis wanted some sort of Islamic country or something. No, Pakistan was created for to keep an eye on Soviet Union, because in those days Soviet Union war and India were the bordering countries. They were neighbors actually. So that's why the Pakistan was created, because India refused to become Western vassal or some sort of Western military base, like like how Western countries have these bases nowadays. Right? How do you think they have these 600, 700, 800 bases all over? This is how it is. South Korea, then Japan, then you take Singapore, then I mean all over. That's how exactly they applied this type of principle all over. Look at Israel. Look at Middle East. Right? So the mechanism was the same, and when India refused, so the Pakistan was created. And in fact, Pakistan was not created in 1947. On paper, theoretically, the concept of Pakistan was actually drafted, or say thought through, between 1945 and 1946. And then 1947 was just the implementation of it, okay? And then the partition riots happened because of the MI6 and the Western intelligence involved into it. Okay, those things don't happen just out of the blue. Now, so West wanted India into its strategic architecture, and Soviet Union was like, okay, Soviet Union wanted India on its side. Why? Because at that time, Soviet Union was surrounded by all the Western supporting country, China, Pakistan, then Iran was there, Afghanistan was there. All these countries used to basically support Soviet Americans. So Soviet Union realized that if India also joins the club, then there will be a bigger problem. So Soviet Union had to, one way or the other, support India. And also you have to understand this, that Soviet Union and China had a war, a brief conflict in 1959, where Chinese had attacked Soviet Union. So Soviets never trusted Chinese either. So they were like, okay, only country that they can trust at this point, trust in the sense that they don't feel threatened by, is India. Anyways, so India basically refused to join Western alliance and pursued what they called it strategic autonomy. And they also said that we are going with non-aligned movement. Okay. And Soviets were like, okay, hey, we are good, that's fine, whatever. But behind the scenes, India did say non-aligned on paper in front of everyone, but behind the scenes, what was going on is that because of all the Soviet help in, say, setting up the plant, setting up the nuclear power plant, setting up the steel power plants, the Indian industries, the initial Indian industries, industrial revival happened because of the Soviet Union. And because of that, India became pretty close to Soviet Union. And then 1965 war. So the worst part was that in each and every war, Americans were actually arming Pakistanis, and India needed some sort of help on that front. Now, India and Soviets basically signed a friendship treaty behind the scenes to counter Western support of Pakistan and China. And we saw the result of it in 1971 Bangladesh war, where India, because of Indo-Soviet treaty, Soviets supported India against the America and United Kingdom's seventh fleet that was entering Bay of Bengal and all that. So all that happened, right? And so this was during the Cold War phase, and then 1974, India actually did a nuclear test, peaceful nuclear test, uh, with the help of Russians or Soviet Union. So India gained what? Diplomatic cover, strategic space, and all that. Okay. So let me actually share my slide with you real quick. Now, and from since that point, what's also Soviet did is that Soviets supported India at the for the veto power and all that too. Okay, so this is how India basically countered. India and Soviets countered the Western diplomatic pressure or diplomatic trap at that time. Then came the post Cold War phase. Now, during the post Cold War phase, we all know Soviet Union collapsed. Russia entered the economic chaos. Then Russian inflation was so bad that it was like 2000% or something. Industries collapsed. Russians were selling coffee for 5,000 rubles a cup. Then, so the whole thing was that Russia, so West thought after the collapse that Russians will probably join the Western Bloc. Why? Because Boris Yeltsin, at that time the president of Russian Federation, he was nothing but a Western puppet. Okay, anybody who knows this thing, you can go look into it. You will find what I'm talking about. Okay, Boris Yeltsin was a Western puppet. Okay, and so Western countries, they thought that okay, now they have Russia under their control. And when this happened, the India was like, okay, Russian economy is hurting, so how about we help Russians? Because India was like, okay, we don't want Russians going towards China. So India started to increase the defense ties with the Russians at that time, because Russians were still uh, militarily, they were very strong. So India started to order MiGs, Sukhois, then naval systems, military equipment, you just name it. Okay. All that India started to buy from Russia. So by that time, in few years, what happened, couple of decades, what happened is that India has 70% of Russian hardware, from T-90 tanks, T-72, T-90, MKI, all that, just name it. Okay. So what it did is that it helped Russia. It helped Russia with defense revenue, industrial continuity, and all that thing. And major strategic partner, they got the major strategic partner outside the Western structures. And so West thought that, okay, by doing all this, with Boris Yeltsin and all, they are going to so they invited Russians into G7, and G7 became G8. The whole plan was that let's try with honey to trap the bee. But bee was not bee. Actually, it was a wasp. And Russians, basically what they did is they just they realized that okay, that it's all about taking the resources of Ukraine and then uh, taking over Crimea. That's what Western countries were eyeing. So by the time actually President Putin took over, and then after that, we all know what happened. But this is how India and Russia actually helped each other uh, and they saved each other from the diplomatic trap. Okay, but all this is just half of the story actually. Now, yes, India and Russia, India bought Russian military hardware, Russia supported India militarily and all that good stuff. Fine. But how are you going to actually get out of the financial trap? Soviet Union collapsed for a reason. Okay. Western countries, they learned something. They learned that there is no need to fight conventional war, or there is no need for doing all kinds of nuclear tests or develop weapons or something. They figured that this control should be shifted from military blocks to financial systems. Okay, this is why the dollar trap was created, energy trap was created. And by the time Russian economy would recover or something, the dollar had become central to the global trade, and Russia was part of G8. And but still, Russian economy was facing lots of pressure through different things. And then in modern day, they were facing problems through sanctions and financial restrictions, trade restrictions, and everything else that come with the sanctions. Then India faced another problem. India was facing the problem of supply chain bottleneck. What was that supply chain bottleneck? That India imports more than 85% of its crude oil requirements. Okay, let me share my slide here. So you stay with me, because this is very important stuff. You have to understand what exactly happened, how countries work together to counter certain things which we may not even see. Now, so India had this energy supply bottleneck. Western countries were like, okay, you buy crude oil from us, we will give it to you. This is what President Trump is trying to do, right? He's trying to divert the whole entire supply chain towards Venezuela, towards US, towards other countries that are in the Western Hemisphere. Direct that energy supply chain into the Western Hemisphere, and then what you do is that you control the whole entire supply chain militarily, meaning that if Chinese, I'm just giving you an example, okay, if Chinese want to sell their, do the trade or sell their stuff in this, in the Latin America, which is almost 600 to 700 billion dollars of trade annual, then Chinese will have to abide by what Americans have to say. They will have to listen to it, right? And that's the strategy, at least on paper. And India sees that thing too. India sees that, okay, this is going to become a problem. So and because India imports 85% of its crude oil requirements, that means that oil prices, dollar movements, all that directly affect the inflation and currency stability. And India actually imports $130 billion worth of crude oil, and that requirement is going to grow and it's going to go up. First of all, because of weakening dollar. Second, because of the inflation, the global inflation, right? And then third, because of all the war risk and all that, right? So when that happens, then India's currency becomes at risk. And Russia, at this point, Russia is also facing the same thing, that okay, because of inflation, and how do we manage all this? Russia needs buyers, and India needed reliable and affordable energy. So before the Ukraine war, uh, Russian oil, India imported only 2% of its total crude from Russia. But now, by 2026, it is like 35 to 40%, and India is going to actually further increase it. So, and India also possesses what, refining capacity, which exceeds almost 250 million metric tons annually, and it is like one of the largest refining hubs. So, what happens in Russian crude? India buys cheap Russian crude from Russian crude. India refines it. India sells that crude at a standard price. So what India gained? India gained low cost energy, supply continuity, and refining leverage. Then Russia gains what? Stable revenue, rock solid market, export continuity, right? Then and then it reduced the dependence on the Western market, because Russia's European market is completely gone. So that was the whole idea. Idea was that Russians have already lost European market. Now do something so that Russians lose that South Asian and Asian market too. That's what Donald Trump went to do in China. He was just showing Chinese that, hey, look, we're gonna cut your energy supply from here. We're gonna cut your energy supply in from Venezuela and all that. And also, we are going to hit your cargoes that are actually going to, all your exports that are going to Latin America. So we are gonna let you. We are not going to let you trade over there. and chances are the Chinese did not agree to it. And also, in return for what? In return for rare earth and all that. Hey, you maintain your rare earth supply to us, otherwise this is what we are going to do. That's what was, I think, the negotiation behind the scenes that happened between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. Now, and why after right after that, why Vladimir Putin, President Putin, actually he went to China. He went to China because it's highly likely that Chinese are going to be like, hey man, this is what he's saying. So how about we increase the energy and this and that? So crude oil supply, Russians are going to increase the crude oil supply to China as well. Okay. But this is how Russia and India countered this whole entire Western supply chain crap or supply chain trap, energy and dollar based supply chain. India and Russia, what they are doing, they are trading in their national currencies too. China and Russia are trading in national currencies, right? So this is another thing. Like diplomatic trap wise, in modern day, what they did, India, Russia, China, they all formed what? A multilateral organization, BRICS. So this is how things get managed around the world in geopolitics in the multipolar world. All right. Now let's look into another trap. What exactly was being done? Then comes the third trap. Third trap was a defense and technology trap. Okay. And this is one of the very obvious type of traps that Western countries were trying to do. They so Americans, so their goal was that let's create a distance between India and Russia, and then what do we do is that we sell our military hardware to Indians and just sell them the hardware, don't enable them for anything else. And that's where the problem started. See, the thing is that defense dependence actually eventually, if you let me share my slide here, okay? That dependence eventually becomes political dependence. Okay, so the dependency trap logic is that if another country controls your spare parts, upgrades, maintenance, military ecosystem, your strategic flexibility narrows to zero. Just like Pakistan. Look at Pakistan, right? What happens over there? Now, on the other hand, India buys Russian hardware or bought Russian hardware back in the day. So India's only condition was that you're not going to sell that hardware to India's enemies like Pakistan or something. And Russians agreed to it, fair enough. And Russia also needed long term strategic partners. So their relationship basically moved beyond simple weapons sale. They started to collaborate into defense partnerships, starting to produce things together like BrahMos joint development, S-400 system, nuclear submarine cooperation, and you just name it. And lots of nuclear reactors in India are being built by Russians. Right now, I think that there are 12 nuclear reactors that are being built by Russians. Okay. So that's the defense and technology trap. Russians have given India the technology to build the icebreaker. Russians are and but what it does, see, it's not just that Russians are giving to India. I want you to understand this. This is not just one way street here. Russians are giving that technology so that India can build icebreakers so that India will be in the Arctic alongside Russia to bolster Russian position in the Arctic. That's number one thing. Second thing is that India and Russia, okay, they trade in rupee ruble. So when Russians get that rupee, they have to invest in the Indian market somehow. And this is one of the ways to do it. Okay. And now, besides nuclear reactors, then your icebreakers, there are lots of other things that Russians and Indians they do together. Okay. So this is why this defense trap or say technology trap hasn't actually worked. So in lots and lots of technological cooperation, like India and Russia, they are working on some space cooperation as well. So all this is there. So what India gains is the technology access, defense capability, indigenous development support, then Russia gains a long-term demand, strategic continuity. Then also, Russian also gets a profit sharing into the joint development programs too. So because when India sells the BrahMos or something else, I believe that there is some sort of profit sharing because India has to talk to Russians and get their approval before actually selling things. Okay. Now I'm not so sure about if there is how the profit sharing works in that thing, but you'll have to look into it. But I believe what else could be the reasoning behind it, unless they're just like, okay, yeah, take it, no problem, right? So there is that. So defense and technology trap. They tried this thing, but the Western countries have tried this thing. In fact, they tried to stop Russia from giving India the cryogenics, but India made its own cryogenics. That is high altitude cryogenics, not the low altitude. India is still working on that. Heavy payload cryogenics, I would call it. Okay, so this is how it happened, and then lots of other things are there behind the scenes that India and Russia help each other technologically and your in defense sector too. Okay, the final trap that was is isolation trap. Now isolation trap was created, like I mentioned briefly earlier, that isolation trap was created so that Russia and India, they don't work together. The whole idea has been from the get go for the Western countries is that don't let the Asian giants become powerful and united, or at least live in harmony one way or the other. That is what they fear. Okay. So now they cannot actually separate Russia and China, but they've been trying really hard to separate India and Russia. This is why after sanctions were imposed on Russia in 2022, everybody rushed to India that, hey, why don't you follow our sanctions and this and that. India said, piss off. And reasoning was very simple. But why don't you just go and ask China why China is not supporting, and why are you buying all the oil from Russia too? So those things were there. That was the isolation trap. They tried it. Let me actually share my slide. So so isolated separately, what happens? Each one is vulnerable together. Vulnerable together, less so, right? Now, so what happens? They tried to isolate Russia, but we all know what happened in BRICS Kazan summit, right? So, and this whole thing, like for example, if you look into it, you find that India brings 1.4 billion people population, then market scale that can't be ignored. World's fourth, fifth largest economy, third by PPP terms, fastest growing major economy, 6.6 to 7% GDP growth. Then fourth largest military power, geopolitical pivot, non-replacement at UN, GN, Quad, BRICS, you just name it, right? Military age population is 600 million plus, which is twice the population of United States. And what Russia brings, world's largest proven natural gas reserve, second largest oil producer, advanced nuclear plus space tech, permanent UNSC seat with veto and all that, military deterrence and everything, right? So they were trying to isolate Russia, and in fact, more I would say, in fact, isolate Russia from Western countries. They were trying to actually separate Russia and India, and then Russia and China like that. But what happened is the 2000 Kazan summit. We all saw that they were about to release the BRICS currency and everything. That panicked President Donald Trump too, and we all saw what happened, right? So all in all, the whole isolation trick never worked either. And when Russians were isolated, or at least West tried to isolate Russia, India supported it. And India not just supported Russia through isolation, because to eliminate that isolation or something, to provide the full support. India actually helped Russia uh, boost its economy, to make sure that Russian economy stays afloat. Same thing China did. They were not gonna let Russia go down like that. And just but in back in the day, in the Soviet era, India was buying uh, military hardware and other things from Soviet Union and then from Russia too, early days. But now openly this is happening, right? Russia provides energy, defense depth, nuclear depth, and we talked about all that. So this is how it is. This is why the relationship survived. It survived Soviet collapse, it survived economic crisis, it survived sanctions, it survived geopolitical shifts and all, you just name it. I mean, the problems that Soviets and Russians have faced, Indians have also faced the same problem pretty much. And this has become more so structural at this point, okay? And so this is why India and Russia actually they became strategically closer, because they kept solving each other's strategic problems. They complemented each other. Diplomatic vulnerability, financial vulnerability, energy, defense, isolation, just name it. This is why this whole relationship actually matters today. And it matters for the whole world. In fact, it matters for the entire global south, because it became the mechanism for preserving each other's strategic autonomy. India and Russia are preserving and supporting each other without any military alliance today. Something NATO cannot do, what India and Russia or China and Russia or these countries are doing without any kind of alliance. That is unprecedented. So this is it for this video, guys. I hope you liked, you enjoyed the video. Please do like and subscribe, and I will talk to you guys in another video. Take care.